Hi there, Chris DeLeon, and today not speaking specifically to Home Team Game Dev as I typically do, but instead actually going back into It's Been a While, talking about Self-Command, my productivity audiobook, which I like to stress, even though I put a lot of time into it, developed it, it's a good audiobook, includes ebook formats as well in popular formats, is also available at zero cost. Literally, pay zero, input, no payment information. All you have to do is when you go to that page, click on a link that says, I will do 2 hours of essentially good in the world, volunteering by any definition instead, and it's yours in fair trade, because I'd rather that than you not have it if it's useful to you. But the case I want to speak to today is actually specifically one that, as we start to feel overwhelmed, comes up, as we are potentially rolling into some New Year's goals, becomes a factor again. But in general, I think especially as time starts to blur together through when many of us are either needing to stay at home, unable to travel, unable to differentiate a few months from now without having clear plans of what else is going to be any different. What this is about is what to do when you've been continuously putting off something, right? And so like the most common case for this is you've got it on your to-do list, and then the day passes, and you put it on the next day's to-do list. The day passes, and this happens to everybody. This still happens to me after doing this now for many years and being someone who helps other people with it. And so I'm always trying to find better angles of attack at articulating, okay, when we solve it, what are we doing differently than when we don't? It's just like when you're trying to sell someone on something. This is something that, of course, I also have to study for my work, is people don't buy features, they buy benefits, right? People don't want to buy a drill of a certain length, a certain horsepower and torque. For the most part, they want to buy a hole in the wall, is the classic example salespeople use for what you're really looking for is the outcome. And we have to think sometimes about when we are trying to get ourselves to do something, there's an act of sales to ourself. There is a part of us that cognitively, that consciously acknowledges this is worth doing. And then there's the part of us that isn't doing it, that is dragging our feet, that is pushing back, that doesn't see the point, that doesn't feel like it's actually that important, that doesn't see how it fits into a bigger picture. And so it can be a subtle act of sales to ourself to make that case of not losing track of why this keeps coming to our to-do list. Because maybe once we acknowledge why it's so important, it becomes a little bit easier to cross that tipping threshold. It doesn't take much, right? It's often an avalanche. It's once you can start to do it, it's easier to finish. The hard part is, okay, why haven't I even cracked into it yet? And so one thing we can simply do is literally, if you find yourself dragging a task forward from one week to the next, from one day to the next, without having even cracked into it, taking a moment to write to yourself. You don't have to blog this, you don't have to say it to anybody else, you don't have to promise it to a coach or anything. Just identifying for yourself, why is this something you want to do? What do you get out of it? What's the benefit to you? How are you going to feel different when it's done? And these aren't things that even require even much digging, because they're going to be on the top of your mind of course, that's why. But once you've articulated it to yourself, again, it's an act of sales internally to help persuade us that this isn't just something to do for its own sake. This isn't busy work. And once we reconnect to why we put it on our to-do list in the first place, in many cases, that can help us reprioritize it. When something else comes up that doesn't have that same weight attached to it, that doesn't have that same bit of additional effort, that can help. That's something in a couple of cases. Another much more common answer and much more generic is to slice it into something smaller. And so, for example, in the cases that come up for me is I'm working on some updated reels of, I've had a ton of games come out from Home Team in the past year, but our last reel of game footage, as far as, highlight video clips of stuff we've done in the group, came from maybe October last year. It's been a while. We've finished a lot of stuff since then. I've got a lot of new games to go back and do some screen capture of. And it always takes a while, right? Because you got to play further in the game sometimes. You might have to implement new cheat codes to be able to skip there faster, which still takes work anyway. And it might have to do a few different tries to get the thing where the spin is cool, or the explosion's right in the frame, or showing the boss from a good angle. Whatever the thing you're trying to capture, it's non-trivial. And there's a whole bunch of these because we make a lot of games in Home Team. And when I've had on my to-do list, capture games, it's too much. There's too many. I think I literally have 80 on that list, probably because I want to revisit some old ones in a higher resolution, better capture than I originally had. But as soon as we start to cut that smaller, when we chunk it up into smaller pieces, and instead of making my goal, okay, I kept pushing it back when I said I would do all at once, right? When I imagined I would just make some progress and then do more of it the next day. As soon as I'm more concrete and I say, you know what, I'm going to try to do 5. My day's goal is just do any 5. I don't even care which 5. Maybe I'll take the easiest 5. Anything to get myself momentum. And what's nice about this is now that I've dialed it in, I'm not as intimidated by it. It's not as overwhelming. It's not as difficult to wade into to feel like the day was a success. And if I fail that, guess what the next day's goal is? 4, right? I can dial it back by 1. I don't necessarily have to keep it at the same level in a way that while it was still amorphous, it was much harder to calibrate against that. You can't go from do some to slightly less pressure on doing some. As soon as you're concrete about I'm trying to do 5, and the same thing happens, right, if you have reading goals. If you're trying to get through a book and you say, I want to read, I think this also came up for me too, where I was getting a little over ambitious, going through some of the books I'm working on, and one was like, I wanted to read 25% of it in a day. That didn't happen. But when I look back at my previous tracking of how much I was actually reading, it was closer to 12, 13, 14% a day. Once I dialed it back to that, it was easier to ratchet it back up once I could reach that goal. And something to keep in mind is that so often when we're in school, when we're in a workplace, when someone else is assigning our tasks, our sense of success is whether or not we have successfully knocked down the challenge that was put in front of us. When we are the one designing the challenge put in front of ourselves, then it's actually up to us, right, as to how much we are setting up something that we have a reasonable shot at overcoming. And that if we continually just drag ourselves through building up something that is frankly oversized, we're not getting more done. It's not somehow magically resulting in extra things happening that could have not happened otherwise. To the contrary, it adds to our pressure, it adds to our overwhelm, it adds to each day feeling like, in little ways, failing one day at a time, and that eats away at us. That tugs at our morale, that mellows our ability to have a sense that we can next set ourselves up to feel good about, I did the thing I set there for myself to do, and then being able to knock it down. So those are the 2 high-level strategies. One is just to basically, like I say, active sales to yourself. Write down a few reasons as to why you're doing this. And as silly as it sounds, putting it external, not just saying it in your head, writing it down. You could type it if you feel like it. Making it outside of yourself will help. It forces a linear serial articulation in a way that otherwise is just very amorphous and undefined. And we know enough to do it, but we haven't done it yet. Once we do it, it helps us reprioritize. And secondarily, just chopping it up smaller. And this, of course, is like foundational to the strategy of all things that we do in Home Team, or for that matter, my work projects, my ebooks, my audiobooks, my video courses, and so on, where once we take a task and we're not limited by what I could do in one sprint. This is the classic problem with people who are good at game jams but can't take on bigger projects. Once we learn how to chop something up into smaller pieces, we essentially can take on an arbitrary size project. Now there's still a muscle you got to exercise to build up on that, so you don't just try to start and shoot for a 10-year thing. But suddenly you're no longer limited by what can be done in one sitting, because you can chop it up. And once you can chop it up, you can chop up a bigger project by chopping it into smaller projects, by chopping that into smaller projects recursively. But it begins by saying, okay, well, if I kept kicking it forward in my calendar, my schedule, my to-do list, and I wasn't even cracking into it, I'm going to take a well-defined, smaller step of a slice that I'm pretty sure I can do, that's fair to myself, that I'm being a good manager, good boss to myself. I can knock that out. And again, if I don't, well, then I can at least ratchet down, dial down the goal the next day. One of the things I talk about in the Self-Command audiobook is specifically that one of the mistakes that we make is thinking that we can just make up on the lost time, that we can just, okay, well, if I was supposed to write 5 pages yesterday, I didn't, then I'll just write 10 pages tomorrow. And obviously, if 5 pages didn't happen yesterday, 10 aren't happening the next day. Notwithstanding something exceptionally rare having happened to have made the 5 days miss. If it was a typical day, a normal day, and life is ultimately typically a series of typical days and a series of typical weeks. Instead, if I didn't get 5 pages done yesterday, the goal tomorrow needs to be 4 pages, right? We dial it back, we don't dial it up. And that's what enables us to get our footing again, to be fair to ourselves, to build back up the momentum to maintain. And in general, if you want more techniques, strategies, tips around these kind of things about just getting ourselves to do the things that we're trying to do, which is important as ever, especially again this time of year and the circumstances that we're all going through, self-command.com is where you can find out more about that. Download it, check it out. And again, if it's within budget, you can get it that way. It also comes bundled with Self-Calm, my adaptation of Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Alternatively, like I said, there's also a plan on there for scroll down, read more about it, how it works, but you can literally get it at no cost in exchange for doing some good out in the world, helping some people out. And that's it for now. Thanks for downloading, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.